Welcome to HCD's Mindset. I'm Michelle Nigella.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose.
We are on a mission to help you identify what consumer science innovations have a lot of untapped value or are too good to be true.
So join us for more curious conversations as we try to make sense of the complex but fascinating world of human behavior. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another great episode that we have for you on Mindset. It is your hosts, Kathryn Ambrose
and Michelle Nigella.
And we are so excited to be joined today by this fabulous human being. We have Linnea Gandhi with us. Welcome to the show, Linnea.
Oh, thank you, Kathryn. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So before we hop into things, do you want to share, because I actually know you through the University of Pennsylvania is where we were connected. Do you want to share a little bit about how we got to meet each other, and also then a little bit about your origin story, how you actually ended up at UPenn?
Sure. Can I do those in the reverse order?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
That's why
it might be good to say, like, what is your current role?
My current role is a Ph.D. student at Wharton, also a lecturer there, and a little bit of exec ed at UChicago.
Very cool. So how'd you end up there?
Yeah, a winding, unexpected path. I began my career as a research associate, then went into traditional consulting because that's what everybody my age was doing. So I went to BCG for a while, really enjoyed learning about the business world, and ended up going to business school. It was not until business school that I learned about behavioral science, which is my focus area now. And I was lucky enough to learn under Richard Thaler, who is an expert in our field, one of the best experts in our field, and ended up through, again, a lot of luck and a little bit of skill, being his teaching assistant. After doing that at Booth, I then left Booth and went back into consulting at a company that was a behavioral science consulting firm.
So tell us a little bit about the consulting. So the first consulting gig you did, what were you consulting on?
So prior to business school, I was doing strategy consulting, your BCG, across all different types of business problems, looking at the healthcare market, looking at credit cards, all different sort of products. And then after business school, when I went into behavioral science consulting, I was working on very similar problems, but using psychology, economics, and experimentation to help solve them. And this was at Steve Lovett's firm, TGG.
And did you notice a big shift in having a little bit, like you said, like those psychological tools to incorporate into it, as opposed to what you had initially when you were just doing the more traditional consulting route?
Yeah, I thought it was quite a bit different, the way that we would approach a problem. It was always focused on a behavior that we wanted to help the company change for their employees or for their customers. And it almost always involved a lot of data. Again, being attached to academics, we were either doing large analysis of historical and observational data, or we were running experiments, which, again, sort of the bread and butter methods of our field.
So there you are.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I did not do as much of that at BCG, although I assume those techniques are more common now.
So there you are at BCG doing consulting, now using more psychological approaches. What made you want to do a PhD?
Well, actually, I was going to do a PhD during my business school MBA. I thought about it. I took PhD courses, and then I decided to go back into practice because a lot of the ideas I had when I would write papers for those courses were too applied. They were very much focused on what I'd like to call the DV, the dependent variable, the outcome, and much less focused on really precisely narrowing down the theory or the independent variable, what we were trying to mechanistically change. And so it felt like a much better fit to go back out into practice. And so
because the words that you're using are very academic, right? So Kathryn and I like to think in terms of all these variables and really think about these methods and try to explain to people what the theories are behind the ideas that they're talking about. But that doesn't always work out really well in the business world, right?
Yeah.
So you've gone back now, you're back in school and you're getting your PhD. What year are you?
I am going into my third year. I should mention I was consulting between the two degrees, the MBA and this degree for several years, first at that firm and then at my own firm. So just doing behavioral science consulting.
That's awesome. And so it's also interesting because I feel like I hear a lot right now. There's been a big shift of people that are academics going into industry and trying to find their way in industry. I feel like you've done the reverse of that, kind of going against the tide and saying, you know what, I think I do want to go and pursue a PhD. So why now did you decide? Because do you feel like this program is a little bit more applied? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. I think I'm always searching for more rigor. I have a little bit of imposter syndrome, I think like many of us in our adult years. And so I always want better data, less uncertainty, to know that the things that I'm recommending to clients are correct. Mm-hmm. And so when I was working in business consulting, I wanted to run more experiments. I wanted to be more data focused, but we couldn't always do that. It wasn't always feasible, or it wasn't always something a client wanted to pay for. So I finally just said, I'm going to go back into academia because I know those methods are prioritized there, that I will be incentivized to have more rigor, to really use these methods in everything I do.
Now, I know that this is the question you're not supposed to ask someone in a PhD program, but when you're done, what are your plans? Are you going to stay in academia, or do you plan to go back out into the wild world of business?
Well, hopefully both.
Yeah.
I would love to officially be part of academia to get a tenure track position, but I would hope it'd be at an institution that can support research that's in partnership with companies, that has, implications for products and things that businesses can use, much like the project that Kathryn has been working with me on at Wharton over the last couple of years.
And I think that is the direction that things are going. Back when I did my PhD in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, it was a weird world where we would have a journal club and we'd look at an article that maybe had people that worked in industry or was sponsored by industry, and everybody would, turn their nose up to it and say, oh, well, that must be bad research. We can't trust this paper. And it's so funny because I've now gone into industry and I actually see it the opposite now, because you do see a lot of retracted papers in academia. And I think the pressure in academia is publish or perish, right? And so you do have a lot of stress that gets put on professors to have to publish things maybe quicker, or maybe in order to get that grant, it has to appeal to a certain, buzzword or area. And so they can reach out, and maybe do things a little bit too far. But in industry, where everybody thought everything was potentially more corrupt because there was so much money, once you're on the industry side, you actually see that money can be limited, and that the consequences for putting out bad research can be really costly, right? So like now when I look at, industry sponsored research, I'm like, oh, actually this is probably a really good study.
It definitely depends. I think I'm somewhere in the middle, where regardless of if it's in academia or if it was an industry, I think I've just been trained, because I am a little bit of that sweet spot of being in between, where I'm like, I question everything. So I'm like, I don't know if I trust anybody out here.
Which is honestly, it's probably the best way to go.
Yeah.
You should be skeptical, and you should be critically reading anytime you're looking at any of these things, right?
Exactly. But I am curious. So you shared that you are now a part of the University of Pennsylvania. You are in, was it, you said your second year?
I'm in my third year now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're in your third year now. Can you talk, what lab are you a part of? Are you working with a specific professor? And how'd you decide that you wanted to be with that professor?
Yeah, sure. I am working in the computational social science lab, which is Duncan Watts' lab at the university. It's affiliated with 3 different departments, one of them being the one that I came into, which is called Operations, Information, and Decisions. I'm the decisions part of that, not the ops of the IS. And he actually just started it around the time that I started my program. And I really wanted to work with him because his vision is actually very problem centric. He wrote a fantastic article, I think back in 2017, entitled, "Should Social Science Be More Solution Oriented?" And it's all about, look, we've got a lot of methods, we've got a lot of theories out there, concepts, and they're often siloed within the department or the discipline that you work within. But we're all trying to solve often like these big, meaningful problems in the world, whether it be, you know, getting people to take their COVID-19 vaccine and tracking the movement of that data, or fake news and understanding what happens there. So why not make these programs centered around the problem and then have broader collaborations that are interdisciplinary around them? And so he really built this lab to sponsor and create, you know, a safe space for PhD students, postdocs like me to actually grow into that world. A lot of the work draws on computer science, statistics, psychology, social science. And then a lot of what we do involves big data or big infrastructure around data. So again, as Kathryn knows, a lot of what I'm doing is building pipelines and workflows of how we can pull data in from here, organize it in an automated way, and then push it out there so that we can analyze it and also share it with the world and other researchers. And I think he's really one of the few researchers who put an infrastructure or a team around that and has been able to get good funding around it. So it's really for me a dream lab to be part of.
That's awesome. And so you kind of are touching a bit on the work that you are doing right now in the lab, but what brought you to that? Like, what from industry was the reason that you were like, I need to set up these pipelines. I need to really, you know, help find ways to make things a little bit more, not just automated, but just question the research process in general.
I think it's actually something that you and Michelle were just hitting on when talking about research in business and in academia. There's something that a client of mine when I was in business, consulting in behavioral science, that they said to me. They were from pharma, and they said, look, you have to realize that every study we put out, every clinical trial is both medicine and marketing. Like that is the reality of the world that we live in. And, you know, for me, that was a big turnoff as I thought about my own work in industry. But when you come into academia, every paper that I put out there is, you know, both sales and science. It's the same thing, you know, we live in a system of humans and we live in a system of incentives. And I'm not the first to say that. Many people have, where we, like you said, we have to put out papers. We often have to put out papers that have surprising or sexy results. So that frustrated me. And I, you know, it's a very natural path to go on to start the PhD, find a bias, find a theory, tinker at it and get it out there. And I just wasn't interested in doing that. I wanted to try to break the wheel. As someone who's later in my career, I'm lucky to be able to afford to do that and take my time. And so this felt like a lab where I could do slow science. I could do science that wasn't necessarily finding a new concept or a bias and getting some quick papers out there, but really taking the time to build up infrastructure and take a big risk to build something I believed in and hoped that other people could use over time.
That's awesome. And I think you're touching on it. And I know from conversations with you that you are very passionate about the idea of that narrative license. Can you talk a little bit more to that? Like, what is that? And how does that involve researchers when you are putting things out for both marketing yourself and for marketing and for honestly, just that more altruistic, trying to share your data and share your science?
Yeah. And I mean, marketing your work, I should say, is important, right? We have to make it consumable so that other people can learn about it. But I kind of think of this narrative license idea that I've been working on with Duncan and a collaborator, Mia Jovanova, who's in the communications group. You think of it sort of the next stage in the replication crisis or the credibility revolution that we've had in psychology. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with it, but over the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of work thinking about the design of research, not just faking data, like setting that aside, but what are the decisions you're making when you're setting up your experiment? Are you pre-registering what you're going to collect and how you're going to analyze it so that after the fact, you can't tinker around to find some cool result?
Yeah, p-hacking.
Exactly. That's sort of one big bucket of problematic practices, often called questionable research practices. I think that was a phrase coined by Leslie John at Harvard. We're kind of thinking the next stage, right? You've got that data, whether or not you've done QRPs, we kind of think of these as questionable writing practices, QWPs, I suppose. how are you actually weaving it together into a narrative? You know, in science, we get trained, like if you go to any workshop on social science communications, people say you have to tell a story.
Right.
You have to have a narrative. And I believe that's true, but it is really hard to summarize without simplifying. And often once you simplify, you lose a lot of the nuance of the paper. You lose the details about the stimuli you used, the participants. And as we're discovering in a lot of this fields, you can't do that. There's a lot of heterogeneity on who is this going to work for? Which stimuli did I end up using? What dependent variable did I measure and exactly how? When I make small changes at that level, we actually get different results. So when in our narrative, we summarize it to be higher level and more generic, we're actually potentially misleading people, even though we don't mean to.
Well, it's not just misleading people that read your paper, but however you summarize it, and then it gets, let's say, marketed by the university, and then gets picked up on the news wires, then it makes further leaps, right?
Yes.
Where now, like, even if you were to craft your own press release, it's still going to get changed significantly. And so your story that includes, you know, the subjects you studied and the details of that are so important to keeping things in context can definitely be lost along the way.
Exactly. And I don't think I have a solution for that yet. Although there's a classic paper by Wells and Winchell, something like that, a couple decades ago, where they actually look at if you name your stimuli more specifically. So if I, for instance, was having people look at these scenarios, one male, one female, and the male is named John and the female is named Maria. If in my abstract, I say the male stimulus versus the female stimulus, people generalize more. But if I actually use the word John and Maria, people pause and say, oh, this was actually like a very narrow study in the way that it was executed. So I think just finding ways in our summaries to put in more specific words might be one of the solutions that we could look at, supported by that paper, but I haven't yet run research corroborating whether that hypothesis is going to work.
Well, I have heard though that when you are trying, because I have looked into things with memory, and if you a big portion of that involves storytelling and involves you know, the more that you almost personify the whatever it is, the fact that you're sharing, the more likely people are going to be able to remember it and recall it because of the way that it was shared. And so I find it really fascinating because on one hand, you don't want to turn into clickbait and you don't want to overgeneralize, but then on the other hand, you know, if a tree falls and nobody was around, like, did it even happen? Yeah. So it's kind of this fine line that you're trying to balance between, because it goes from either misleading people or no one's going to care and no one's going to even get the chance to see that you researched it.
And that's how we were taught in scientific writing. Whenever you're, you know, writing up your paper for publication, that intro paragraph has to start with the world, right? So you have to start with the relevance that's like the broadest thing possible. You know, if you're going to make an apple pie, you have to start with creating the universe. Like, you have to start out here. So even though, like, my work in grad school was working on, you know, very specific genetic influences of innervation of the gut, you know, like, I had to talk about, like,
food is for everybody.
Right.
Yeah, everybody has to eat. You know, even though it was like very far removed.
How did you feel when you had to write those paragraphs?
Honestly, it just feels like you're just rehashing the same line that everybody in your field uses. So everybody, you know, starts out with, oh, you know, everybody has to eat, but there's an obesity epidemic and, you know, health crisis. And that's why I'm studying, you know, this particular gene in a mouse model, you know? Yeah. And so it ends up, everybody has the same opening paragraph, and we just try to, like, tweak it little ways. And it does seem very disingenuous, honestly.
Right. And so I guess, Linnea, I'd be curious, like, how do you foresee, and, like, this is obviously like more of a prediction and a hypothesis, but, like, how do you foresee keeping insights exciting while still keeping in mind, and relevant, but keeping in mind the nuances of everything that went into your research and the context in which your research lives in?
I think there's two potential solutions. Again, these are more infrastructure solutions or system solutions rather than, hey, here's some tips for how you write your paper. I think one is to write fewer papers.
Yeah.
Collect more data, write papers that are bigger, But actually writing fewer papers and trying to get them perhaps into higher ranked journals, producing less content. We would be able to navigate more of these papers if we didn't have so many of them to read. So some shift in the field towards fewer papers with more data within them, so that you could actually be answering that general question that your abstract is connoting that you're answering. Or answering more of a causal question with a mix of descriptive data and causal data, rather than just putting your descriptive data out there and sort of inferring that there might be causality.
So how do you break that wheel? You were talking about wanting to break the wheel, and it is such a struggle because research publication is like an industry that is run off of very shady practices, right? So, you have labs where, they want to get research grants, and in order to do so, they might have to have 200 publications a year, right? Which means that they need to make sure that they have like as many publications as possible out of this one study they really did, right? They break it up into, say, 5. Right. And then on top of that, just the way that whole machine works is, free labor and, free editing, and they make money off it. Often you have to pay them to publish your research.
Which is crazy.
Like it's a crazy machine that I think not everybody understands.
Right. Speak
a little bit to the frustrations there.
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on that machinery. I'm new to it. It's the more details I learn about it, the more surprised I am, having been outside of it. But I would say is as shocking as the machinery of the publication industry is in academia, every big industry has problems like that. Absolutely. I think there's a quote by this healthcare guy, Paul Batalden: every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. I love that phrase. And I felt like in industry, I came into science and academia to try to presume maybe it would be a little bit better. And it's not, but it's the same, right? It's a bunch of humans trying to work together in a system. So I don't think my work is ever going to shift the system, in any immediate fashion. But I think the things that some of us can do, who might be more people who have more tenure, I don't, but, or just are later in their career, so are able to take more risks, is to do things like Duncan Watts has done. Build a lab where I, as a PhD student, have a safety net to do research like this. I mean, I think if tenured professors can start to create those sort of bubbles where we can be slower and produce fewer publications, but at higher quality, at least in our heads, I think perhaps that will, at least from the ground up, make some impact. But I have no idea how to solve the structural problem.
So it's a little above everybody here.
Yeah.
But I do have a question for you. So I think it's interesting, that notion of having almost quality over quantity when it comes to journal publications. But publications through a journal is not the only way to dispel information, especially given the fact that we're on this podcast together discussing science. What do you think would be great ways to share research? Michelle and I have this ongoing discussion about memetics, or the idea of using memes to communicate science. And so I'm curious, do you think that would be almost a subsector of it, where it's like, let's still share information in a bite-sized way, but maybe through different mediums?
I mean, I love where your head is at. I'm not sure exactly if I'd recommend memes. I think where I'd actually start by answering the question is to think about who's the audience. Why are we in such a rush to push science out there? Part of the reason is the incentive structure of, I want to get a job in 2 years when I'm on the job market, and I need to show a track record, or I need to demonstrate a track record for getting tenure at an institution. That's, I think, one set of motives and different audiences. And, journal editors are an audience, reviewers are an audience, my committee is an audience. And then the other audience would be the people who we want to actually consume the research, which could be other academics in our field that we hope build on it, as well as people out there in the world, practitioners. I do so much in the behavioral science and nudge space. There's a big audience, people like I used to be part of that, who are consuming that. And the problem, I think, is when we think about putting content out, we often try to hit all those audiences at once,
Mhm.
which I think ends up distorting the message. We don't really hit any of them perfectly then.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe thinking about different content for different audiences and perhaps moving slower for the audiences that are more distributed, who don't have the time or the incentives to read it more thoroughly.
I think there has been a shift in the way posters are presented, for example, at conferences, where instead of being so text heavy, where you do have, you know, the description of the intro and description of the message and description of the discussion, it has become more like, here's the data, here's one line in the center, you know, big and bold, that is like the key point to this whole study, you know, so then that's below the title, right? But like right in the middle. So keeping it like, okay, here's the whole point of the study and here's the supporting information. And that supporting information is largely just graphs and visual, right? There's no need to talk about, you know, creating, you know, the universe before the apple pie, right? So maybe that is a good direction to go. It's kind of like memetics in the sense that you're just getting to the point and connecting with people and letting them sort of interpret things from the data, right?
The one thing I'd add to that idea, which I love being more visual, is I think the biggest problem we have when we put stuff out there is the level of uncertainty in that data. We look at means, or we look at a quick p-value, and that's our summary, but getting people to look, honestly, not even at standard errors, but standard deviations, looking at distributions of data, presenting data in a way where we actually see the sample of data points. My hope would be if we could get people to see that and educate them on how to consume that, we would lower their overconfidence level that, oh, if I do this nudge technique, then I will definitely have this behavior, you know, drawing these very snappy inferences.
Absolutely. You know, we make this, you know, when I made the leap going from academia into industry, I was surprised at how few people even knew what standard error was. And how important it is for reading a graph, that means, not memes, but means can be like so misleading, right? And so when you just have means and, you know, averages and p-values, and that literally is all anybody ever looks at, you know, especially when you look at like the advertising and marketing type of world, they just need something that's really simple and straightforward. And so seeing that this average is bigger than that average and that it is significantly different is a lot more meaningful than me pointing out like standard error, right? But it is so important on really understanding your results.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we could talk to you about this forever, but I do want to wrap up. I have one last question for you. And it's really just, if you have any advice for aspiring researchers that maybe want to get their research noticed or funded, but they don't want to sound dry and they're scared people are going to misinterpret their data. Like, what would you say to these people?
I would go back to something I said at the beginning. I would focus on a problem, not on a theory. If you really are obsessed with the problem, like a good entrepreneur, right? Obsessed with the problem you're trying to solve in the world, why is your research important? Then if the theory that you're writing about or researching doesn't work out, you move to the new one. Or you do, I think, more robust research because you're not so tied to proving that one thing right. So I don't know if that's theory agnostic or more ecumenical, like all theories are good, but I've found that attitude, which I've adopted in the last probably year and a half, it's a relief. Like I'm not attached to finding that something absolutely worked and writing it up in a concise story. I'm just attached to writing a story that helps solve a problem. And then I think I write in a more balanced way.
I love that. So we are going to wrap up, but I do want to play our fun game. I know I prepped you a little bit for it, but it is a quick game that we call React Attack. I'm going to list off random words to you and you just say the first thing that comes to your mind.
Free association. It doesn't even have to be related to anybody else. In your mind, it's related and that's fine.
Exactly. All right. So first one, science communications.
Bad.
Clickbait.
Bad.
Narrative license.
Fascinating.
Storytelling.
Hard.
Humans.
Fascinating.
Titles.
Oh, terrible.
Retweets.
I really hate Twitter. I know that's not
that works. That's
word.
Good. Funding.
Very valuable.
Simplification.
Mixed bag.
And the last one, memes.
Funny.
I agree. I think most
I realized
memes should
I
be
did
funny.
adjectives for pretty much everything. I have no idea if that's how you play the game normally.
It's however you
however
want.
you play the game is totally okay because it's free association. It can be whatever you want.
Exactly. So can you share, if people wanted to get in touch with you or chat with you a little bit more, where could people find you?
They can go to the CSS lab, that's Computational Social Science Lab website. You'll be able to see all the projects going on. And I'm on there as well as some great collaborators and Duncan Watts, of course. I am on Twitter, but I'm more of a consumer than a producer. So I don't really recommend following me. But if you want to, it's at Linnea Gandhi.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, stay curious.
Thanks, everyone.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you and stay tuned for more curious conversations.